Welcome back, everybody, to the Peer to Peer Policy Pod. I am Brian Morgenstern here with Sam Lyman. It's a great day in America. Everybody, markets are up. The Bitcoin price is up in the aftermath of President Trump's and the Republicans' clean sweep in the election. This is, I think, a brighter day for business in America, and anybody who is looking at their Bitcoin wallets and their investment accounts. Things are going very well because I think we're going to see some very positive policy shifts in the coming months and years. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button. Follow us on social media at Morgenstern and Jay on X at Sam Lyman 33. Sam, where should we get started? There's a lot of good news to dig into today.
Yeah, so much good news, Brian. I wasn't alive for the Reagan presidency, but if this is what morning in America feels like, then I think I understand now. Just excellent news across the board. The author of The Art of the Comeback, Donald Trump himself, has probably what could be considered the greatest political comeback in American political history, going from it's so over in 2020 to we are so back in 2024. Let's start, though, with election night, Tuesday of last week. Brian, I know you were there in Florida. I know as well that you called this election to a T. So let's start with that. How did you displace Nate Silver as the number one guru of election prognostication here? It's pretty impressive what you've done.
Yeah, I mean, it was fairly simple in that I just assumed that mainstream media outlets and their favorite pollsters never learn anything. And it turns out that I was correct because I looked at polls from 2016 and 2020. I figured out which ones were reliable and which ones were trying to influence elections rather than reflect and predict what the people wanted. So I looked at the error rates from most of the mainstream polls. Like I said, I figured out which ones were mostly accurate, which ones weren't. And then I applied those statistics to the polls that existed before the election and predicted Trump was going to win the popular vote 50 to 48. I predicted he was going to win all 7 swing states because he was polling better than he ever had in the prior 2 elections. And assuming they were just as wrong this year as they were in past years, I knew he was going to win all 7 swing states. He was going to win the popular vote. So I got it right. I am very proud of that. I wish I had a Nostradamus costume to put on right now because I feel very vindicated. And this was, I think, a repudiation of the policies that we've seen over the last 4 years and the attitude towards working people that, the approach in this election, Trump kind of went around to different constituencies and asked them, like, what do you want to see? What would help you in terms of policies? And then he said, okay, if you vote for me, I'll do that. The Democrats continued to talk down to people and say, no, 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 we know what's good for you. And people didn't like that. It did not go well, obviously, for the Democrats. It worked for Trump, and I am very proud that I predicted it. Of course, I had my own preferences, but I really just wanted to figure out what do I think is actually going to happen. And it turns out I was correct. So very proud of that. If anybody wants to start an election prediction betting market with me or invest in my future hedge fund because of my accurate predictions, I am all ears, but very, very proud that I actually got it right. Nate Silver and all the other pollsters are totally overrated. Many people are talking about it, and I'm very proud of my prediction.
Yeah, impressive that you nailed not only the electoral college vote, but the popular vote as well. And I'm surprised every year by how wrong the pollsters are and how much money goes to them, even in spite of being wrong consistently year in and year out. So poly market was an interesting phenomenon this election. You see poly market playing a big role today with predictions for who will be the next cabinet secretary in various positions. It's interesting. I think pollsters have been displaced by the people in many ways. The people themselves have a better pulse on reality than media figures. And that's something that we'll discuss in just a little bit. But before we go to that, Brian, like I said, I know you were at Mar-a-Lago the day of the election itself. Take us behind the scenes. What was it like? What was the feeling on the ballroom floor like? What was it like the day after? It'd be really interesting just to give our listeners a behind the scenes of things there on election night.
Yeah, I mean, I was at Mar-a-Lago during the day. Everybody was feeling, optimistic. They really did feel like they left it all on the field, and that if they didn't win, at least they could say, They did everything they could to win. There was definitely a sense of exhaustion. I talked to some folks who were on the plane on Trump Force One with the president and flying around, and they were all very tired. And I had asked, did you get any sleep? And they said no, because when they were coming back from Michigan in the middle of the night after his rally, which was at like 2 o'clock in the morning, and they were landing in Palm Beach at like 5 in the morning. They were all laying around the plane like zombies, just totally wiped and totally exhausted, except President Trump. He was blasting music and dancing around and having a great time. And they were all saying, "How on earth are you doing this?" They were all decades younger than he is, but he still had the energy of, the Energizer Bunny. So pretty impressive. Like the president says, he's built different. He certainly is even different from some of the younger people on his own team. So they were tired but optimistic. Um, it was, overall, I think pretty joyous. A lot of members of Mar-a-Lago, members of the Trump family around, key staff, and they, I think they were just really excited to see the results come in after all of their hard work. Then I went over to the convention center where the results were coming in. They had giant TV screens, and it was, uh, a lot of the Trump world figures were there. I got to meet Sage Steele. Danica Patrick was there. I saw Majority Whip Tom Emmer. He was celebrating. He's very happy. Some of our colleagues in the Bitcoin industry that had supported President Trump were there. And I think what we're looking at now is footage of that. That would have been probably around 1:30 a.m. or 2 a.m. when they called the election on Fox News. The decision desk officially projected that Trump was going to be the 47th president of the United States, and everyone erupted in cheers and taking pictures of the screen and chanting USA, USA. It was very joyous. Everybody was pretty tired because we had been on our feet on that concrete floor for, I don't know, 6 hours or something. So we were tired, but we were still very excited. And it was really a joyous occasion, really happy atmosphere, jam packed, as you can see. We were crammed in there like sardines, but we were all just thrilled to be able to be there and celebrate the results that we wanted to see. So it was a lot of fun. And then the next morning, it was a little bit more exhaustion, but still celebrating and talking about what's next. And we're starting to see that with cabinet appointments rolling out, and we're getting a little bit better idea of what to expect over the next 4 years. But really, really cool to be there on election night. It was a lot of fun. I was in the White House in 2020 election night where things were not looking so good. Well, they were at first, and then things changed, and then there was a week-long vote count and all of that. But having been on the team when we lost, and then on the team, or at least present with the team when we won, I can tell our audience without a doubt it is a lot more fun to win than it is to lose. So this was a great experience, and feeling very good about the next 4 years.
Yeah. Well, Brian, it's interesting because the jubilee on the ballroom floor and just the excitement and optimism that we felt in the last week really contrasts sharply with feelings on the other side of the aisle among Democrats, right? It's a funeral over there, or could be, and in many ways it is, because this election seems to signify more than a simple electoral defeat. It seems to signify the death of wokeness, or the death of a fringe faction within the Democratic Party that has had a chokehold, not just on the party, but really on the country for the last decade, I'd say. So there's a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's some introspection in the Democratic Party right now about what went wrong. And some of the more bold members of that party have the courage to conduct an autopsy to figure out, where did we go wrong here? One of those people is Chris Murphy. He actually had a tweet thread recently where he talks about, in very honest terms, what happened on election day. And he says this was a cataclysm. It was an electoral wipeout. And he gives some thoughts about where the Democratic Party might shift course. He says, interestingly, the left has never fully grappled with the wreckage of 50 years of neoliberalism. So there's some recognition on the left right now that it has become the party, not of the people, but of the moneyed elite, of corporations, of businesses. And it's essentially sold out the working man. And Donald Trump came along and he realized that the working man needed representation in Washington. And so he completely remade the Republican Party to cater to the needs of the working class, and not just the working class, but all Americans as well. So Donald Trump has assembled this really powerful coalition that has taken him back to the White House starting in January. Meanwhile, Democrats have essentially been playing in their old Obama era playbook for the last 10 years. Really interesting evidence that shows that Democrats are playing 10 years behind Republicans right now can be seen in the kind of media that Democrats consistently consume. Can you bring up that tweet, Dylan? So this shows that Democrats, they are much more prone to read newspapers. They're much more prone to watch network TV, whereas Republicans are much more likely to use new media, be it podcasts, YouTube, or social media itself. And I think Democrats, they've long prided themselves on being the party that comes around first to tech, that is ahead of the curve. But that's clearly not the case in the media landscape. And I believe that Republicans, they won this election in large part because they played in the new media landscape with figures like Joe Rogan or Theo Vaughn, Lex Friedman. They won the podcast election without a doubt. So, Brian, I'm curious your take on the Democratic autopsy. The media is one aspect of it, but then there's just policy issues on the Democratic side as well. Why do you think the Dems lost this election? And do you think they have the self awareness to correct course at this point?
Well, I was interested to see Senator Murphy's tweet thread because if anybody needs to look in the mirror, it's him. I mean, he was one of these people saying that anybody who believes in the Second Amendment and the right to protect your family and have firearms in the home, he was somebody saying that Republicans who support those positions were terrorist sympathizers and that they wanted to sell guns to terrorists. And, he's been a chief antagonist of Trump. Meanwhile, Trump, during this campaign worked at McDonald's and got in a garbage truck and, made every effort to show that he is sympathetic and empathetic to the plight of the working man, where Murphy represents Connecticut, the epicenter of this neoliberalism, as he calls it, and has really been one of the worst offenders. So to see him do kind of an about face, I mean, welcome to the party, pal. Better late than never, I guess. And my hope is that, nobody is as pious as the converted. So hopefully he's genuine in his sentiments. James Carville had some very frank remarks as well, that what the Democratic Party's been doing is not worth it, not worth a bleep, and is saying that, you need to get out of Washington. You need to go spend time with the people, work on campaigns, talk to folks on the ground. I think that's right. In terms of the media landscape, we may get into this a little bit, but the Democrats have had a monopoly on the media industrial complex for decades. So they really did get outflanked. And the Republicans that, President Trump and the campaign and other kind of new media figures have started to realize the system's not really working for your everyday American. We need to see reforms. And the message ended up going directly to the people and sort of reflecting what the people wanted. Whereas the old media, the legacy media, continued to just kind of talk down to people and try to cram these bad ideas down people's throats. One of the most effective ads had to do with the trans issue and women's sports. And that's like an 85-15 issue. Like if somebody has gone through puberty as a man and then wants to compete against women, that is not a level playing field. It's sort of common sense for most people, but it was the sacred cow for the legacy media. So that's just one example. But the point I'm illustrating is that when you go directly to the people through podcasts or social media or some of these other new outlets, and you can actually get people's opinions and reflect them, it's a much more small d democratic way of approaching elections. And you're right, the Republicans really are ahead of the curve. Now, there's still big tech involved here. Google is still, I think, a left-wing company. They still have a huge amount of power in moderation and censorship, but there's new outlets. The one that we're on right now, Rumble, is committed to free speech. I think it's going to grow in the coming years because people are shedding these old filters and realize that they don't really need them and they don't really trust them. You showed that graphic about newspapers. Well, one thing that I don't think the Democrats have quite grasped yet, maybe they're beginning to, is that there's a reason that a lot of the electorate is getting away from these outlets. It's not just because they're garbage people or uneducated or anything like that. It's that they don't trust them because they've been misled so much. I mean, some of the big billionaires that ended up supporting Trump, some of the tech executives who recognized that the country needed to make a shift in policy, they realized that um, there really was a disconnect. I think may have been Bill Ackman, maybe it was Vivek, maybe they both reflected on this. I forget who it was, but some of the big influencers here, they or maybe it was Chamath on the All In podcast, mentioned like the very fine people hoax, where the media said that with the Charlottesville incident that Trump was saying the neo Nazis and white supremacists were very fine people. That's not what he said. If you continued to play that clip, you saw that he said, and I'm not talking about those people, they should be condemned. So he literally said the opposite of what the news media was reporting. And there are still people in the media industrial complex who haven't seen that whole clip or who are consuming that media. They still think that that's a real story, that it's not fake news, but it really is. And so some of these people had their eyes opened and they realized that they shouldn't be trusting these legacy institutions. They should do a little more research. They should have more access to information. And so these long form conversations on podcasts, for example, really do give you a better sense of what that person is like, what their thought process is like, the things that they're considering, and some out of the box ideas that will actually help the American economy grow and make things better for people. So I think it's a really positive sea change that we're seeing. And it really is, Republicans being more in touch with the people than Democrats. So hopefully the Democrats realize that it'll be better for everybody if both parties are actually looking at what people want rather than just accepting the conventional wisdom and trying to cram it down people's throats. We're going to have a much better functioning democracy if we do see this trend continue.
Yeah, I agree. The one problem is I think it's going to take years, honestly, to disentangle the tentacles of DEI that have essentially led the Democratic Party into what we could only call a competency crisis. I mean, if you have Kamala Harris being put forward as top candidate for president in the Democratic Party when she revealed herself to be someone completely incapable of going off script, someone completely incapable of talking off the cuff, of being authentic in any way, just goes to show that the Democratic Party is still very beholden to the fringes, to the people who are pushing the woke ideology, the critical race theory. I think you even saw a little bit in Chris Murphy's tweet. He starts out pretty strong, recognizing, I think, the issue that the Democratic Party has sold itself out to corporate interests. But then he goes further into his tweet thread, and after giving a nod to the working class, he then tries to condemn what he calls nativism. He says that the Republican Party is now the party of nativism. I'm sorry, but there's a huge difference between liking your country and not thinking it's terrible and evil and being nativist. I think that's what Democrats don't realize as well, is that people like America. They want to like America. This constant messaging that America is inherently evil or inherently racist, that only plays among a very small crowd of Ivy League liberal arts graduate students. There's really no demand for that kind of messaging outside of that. And so I think just the fact that we saw within Chris Murphy's own tweet thread, there's still that nod towards racial identitarianism. I think it means that they're going to be in the wilderness for longer than one cycle. I could be wrong. You never know. Things can change really quickly in American politics. Let's go back to 2004. After John Kerry was defeated, I think a lot of Dems thought it was over for them for a while. And then you have Barack Obama coming along the scene in the next cycle. So, of course, as people on the right, we can't rest on our laurels in any way. But I do think that the left has a lot of introspection to do there that they quite simply haven't done yet. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out. Brian, before we move on to Bitcoin, anything else you want to touch on the Democratic autopsy?
Well, it's interesting. Some of what President-elect Trump has been coming out with now seems to have some support from Democrats, from appointments to governing approach. I mean, Mike Waltz, the congressman from Florida, former Green Beret, is going to be national security advisor. I've seen some Democrats come out in support of him because they know him personally. They think he has good judgment. The government efficiency commission Doge, which we can talk a little bit about later. Um, enlisting Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to look at government spending and try to get the behemoth bureaucracy under control. I mean, there are some Democrats coming out and saying, we support government efficiency too. So there's already some areas of agreement, which is very encouraging that it's not just going to be another scorched earth. Hopefully they're not trying to impeach him on day one like they were last time. So a little bit more optimistic. I think the party does have a long way to come in terms of the Democrats, like you said, but I do see them taking to heart this shellacking a little bit. And so I'm somewhat encouraged that it'll be a less crazy hostile environment. I think the lawfare backfired big time on them. Trying to jail and bankrupt your political opponents does not play well amongst the normies. So I think we're going to have a little bit of a chastened party. Certainly not the fringes, but you're going to see, I think moderates have a stronger voice in the next 4 years. So we will see. Today is an optimistic day. Things are never easy forever. There will be tough times ahead at some point, but right now things are trending up and to the right for the incoming Trump administration.
Speaking of up and to the right, let's talk about the up and to the right price action we've seen with Bitcoin recently. So Bitcoin started to track Donald Trump's electoral odds starting probably back in the summer. So for those who may not know, Donald Trump bear hugged Bitcoin earlier this year. He came out and he said that he wanted all Bitcoin to be made in the USA. He wanted the United States to become the crypto capital of the planet. And so as Donald Trump's electoral fortunes improved, so too did the price of Bitcoin. Immediately preceding the election, it started to have an upward tick. And ever since he was elected last Tuesday, it's been on an absolute tear. So it's reached new all-time highs. It's tickling $90,000. Some think it will break out in the next week here to go even above $90,000. All the while, you have potentially Howard Lutnick, who's a big Bitcoin bull, being rumored to be possibly the next Treasury Secretary. So these are amazing times for Bitcoin. Brian, what do you make of all this? Can you break down why the orange man is so good for the orange coin?
Yeah, well, he saw, he saw electoral prospects, which, we know as members of the Bitcoin community, we know how rabid these people are, how passionate they are for their cause, for this new financial tech, and for the way it promotes individual freedom. It, to some extent, can cut out middlemen. It's also a sound money, which is sort of a return to where we were back before the U.S. left the gold standard, tying our money to actual commodities, things that have a reflection of price in the real world rather than having this kind of floating currency. So a lot of people are attracted to this, and they are not typically very partisan or politically involved. So Trump saw an opportunity correctly that he could get a lot of people to vote on this issue. And then from a policy standpoint, it really is the right policy. We're seeing other countries get involved. We're seeing a global competition for Bitcoin emerge, and he wants the U.S. to lead that competition. He wants the U.S. to win in everything. And so this is one of those things that will help the American economy grow and help us compete with other nations. He talked about a Bitcoin strategic stockpile. Senator Lummis has introduced legislation to create a national Bitcoin reserve. I think we're going to see a much more friendly energy department in trying to create more generation in the U.S., make sure we have the power we need for the economy of the future, for AI data centers, Bitcoin mining, everything else that's going to require electricity. Remember, he had that very funny line from his speech at the Bitcoin conference. We're going to make sure we have plenty of electricity. So much electricity, you'll be saying, please, sir, no more electricity, sir. We already have enough. That really is the mindset the country needs in order to meet the goals that we have for the future. So, the SEC chair, of course, in that speech, he also promised to remove Gary Gensler, and he got thunderous applause for that line. So the financial regulators, I think the banking regulators are going to be called to end choke point 2.0, where they've been trying to debank a lot of companies that are politically disfavored by the establishment. I think that nonsense will stop. Like I said, more energy generation, I think, will be a great development for this ecosystem. So lots of different policy areas that are bullish for Bitcoin. And I think that's going to be great for President Trump's approval ratings as well once he's back in office. So both from the political perspective and policy perspective, I think he's really seen the opportunity here and seized it, and it helped him get back to where he is today, which is president elect.
Yeah. A truly exceptional political entrepreneur to recognize that there were so many Americans who needed representation who owned Bitcoin that simply weren't getting it, especially in the midst of one of the most hostile administrations we've ever seen towards digital assets. And the good news is it's not just Bitcoin that's on a tear. It turns out traditional finance really likes the Trump election as well. The S&P 500 has had a huge upward tick in the last couple of weeks, in large part because they recognize that Donald Trump could bode well for equities. So, Brian, let's talk more about that. In addition to the Trump bump for Bitcoin, are we also in the midst of a Trump trade 2.0? And if so, why might that be the case?
Yeah, I do think that. I mean, looking at the Bitcoin industry in particular, you've had the Biden administration basically engaged in a crusade to put us out of business for 4 years. And then you had Trump saying that he wants our country to lead the world in Bitcoin and be the superpower of the world and the crypto capital of the planet. I mean, you can't ask for a starker contrast than that. If you look at the energy industry, he has said he wants to take the shackles off. He wants to use the liquid gold that's under our feet. We have more than Saudi Arabia. He wants us to be the energy leader of the planet. That's a huge industry that I think will do well. And when we have more power, more abundant, affordable power, that means inflation is going to come down. It means goods are going to cost less. We're going to be able to produce more. We're going to have more productivity in America. The manufacturing sector, the Biden administration gave a lot of lip service to bringing manufacturing back to the US, but Trump has put the money where his mouth is and said, look, if countries have unfair trading arrangements, they have trade barriers, tariffs and other things, we're going to do reciprocal trade. And what people often think of is, oh, well, that's going to cause prices to go up. But if you finish the thought, and say he's going to have reciprocal trade barriers, it means those countries are going to be forced to the negotiating table so that both countries can hopefully end up lowering barriers and opening more markets for American companies. That's going to spur more job creation, more economic growth here in the US. And I think people understand that. Additionally, the way, some of your, I'm going to use big air quotes around experts who say, oh, his policies are inflationary. Well, not if you're cutting government spending, you're reducing the cost of energy, you're making it more abundant. Those things are deflationary. And then in terms of tariffs, if it's products that are being made overseas because of barriers to making them here in the US, well, then the consumer is going to have a choice. They can either pay less for things that are made domestically or pay more for things that are made overseas, or we're going to see the barriers come down together, sort of in concert. And then everything is going to be more affordable and you're going to be able to make more things here in the US. So I think the market is reacting correctly, notwithstanding some of the very hostile reports in the media and very hostile quote unquote experts who are really pushing more of an agenda than they are actual facts. So I think the marketplace of ideas is translating into the marketplace for equities, and I think that's why you're seeing this very positive reaction to the Trump election.
Yeah, I've even had Democratic friends who work on Wall Street. One reached out to me this morning and admitted that he was optimistic. He admitted, hey, I didn't vote for Trump, but so far, this is looking pretty good for my industry, which was the point I was trying to make to him all along. But I think there's a lot to look forward to, whether it's with equities, with Bitcoin, with the strength of our military. Really, all sectors of our economy, I believe, will benefit from the Trump presidency. Let's talk a little bit more about Bitcoin, though. Brian, you and I, we've been involved in Bitcoin policy for a while now. If you had a magic wand, or if you had, let's just say, the president's ear for those first 100 days of a Trump presidency, what sort of policies would you recommend that he put in place to fulfill his promise of making America a Bitcoin superpower?
Well, one, I think the US will benefit from a Bitcoin strategic reserve, a strategic stockpile, as Trump has called it. So if he directs the government not to sell its Bitcoin, to hold it, to make sure that our, debt pressure is somewhat relieved by this burgeoning market, I think that's a a great sign and would be a great signal for Bitcoin. The energy piece, taking the energy department off of our backs and making it a facilitator of deals so that we can get more energy production. There's an Office of Critical and Emerging Tech at the Energy Department. I think it was created under the Biden administration. I think kind of redirecting that to be connecting energy companies with Bitcoin miners and other data center companies so that you have consumers of energy and creators of energy cooperating better and having a deregulatory atmosphere so that you can really just put the pedal to the metal and create the energy that we need. That's going to be hugely beneficial. The SEC and CFTC, they've had regulation by enforcement that's been less consequential for Bitcoin miners, but certainly has had an effect on the industry writ large, exchanges and other ways that Bitcoin is traded. I think we've seen Mark Ueda, who's a commissioner on the SEC, saying we need a working group to just completely retool the way we approach this and foster innovation while still maintaining appropriate guardrails for consumer protection, rather than taking the regulation by enforcement first approach. I think that's going to be a hugely beneficial sea change. So there's a number of these different policy areas. You've had White House offices, the Office of Science and Technology, the National Economic Council, National Security Council, taking very hostile positions towards Bitcoin. I think coming in with more of an open mind is going to be very important. On the tax piece, look, the SEC and CFTC even recognize Bitcoin as a commodity, but the IRS hasn't gotten the memo. They're still taxing it when it's mined. They're taxing it again when it's sold. I think treating it like gold or oil or corn or any other commodity where it's just taxed when sold, it's going to be administratively easier to manage. It's going to be legally correct. It's going to help the industry to grow and thrive better because they're not going to have to worry about like selling their Bitcoin just to pay taxes, which of course, can depress the value. I think you're going to see really an explosion of value in this industry with all of these different policy changes on taxes, on energy, on financial regulation, on fostering American innovation and growing the economy here. It's all going to be really positive. And he's expressed, openness to that. His speech at the Bitcoin conference was fantastic. He really talked about a lot of these things. So I'm hopeful that he's heard this message. He's going to have people in his ear reiterating it and trying to hold them accountable that they keep their promises because it's going to be really good for the country and really good for these industries.
Yeah. And among the most consequential policies, I believe, could be the strategic Bitcoin reserve. It's interesting, Brian, over the summer, this was really kind of a fringe idea. You and I were aware of it because there was lots of talk about a strategic Bitcoin reserve on Bitcoin Twitter. And then I wrote an article back in July, essentially making the case for the Bitcoin strategic reserve in Forbes. So it was the first time in legacy media that this idea kind of permeated the mainstream, so to speak. And ever since then, there's been a lot of momentum behind the idea. It's so much so that we have people talking about a strategic Bitcoin reserve on cable network news now. Can you play that clip, Dylan?
Mentioned to one of our earlier guests that BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF, it now has more assets under management than their gold ETF. Of course, we know gold is a safe haven. I know a lot of your investors, they hold gold as well. What's their sentiment when it comes to Bitcoin? And are they doing it directly or through ETF?
We're very high on Bitcoin, and we've been talking about Bitcoin for the past few years. We recommend doing it directly because you don't pay taxes if you're doing it directly. So that's a big difference. But we think that Bitcoin could become the next strategic reserve asset. Country now holds 232,000 Bitcoin. We think that Trump could bump that up to over 1 million.
So there you go. We have wealth advisors now encouraging people to buy Bitcoin because they recognize it could very soon become a strategic reserve asset. It's something that, as you mentioned, Brian, Donald Trump promised to do. He promised to make a national Bitcoin stockpile at the Bitcoin Nashville conference. And in addition to that, we have Senator Lummis, the crypto queen of Congress. She recently came out, introduced a bill shortly after Donald Trump put forward his idea. And she emphasized again, just after the election, in all caps, we are going to build a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So big news there. We also have Democratic support for the idea coming out in Representative Ro Khanna, who's been very forward thinking on this issue. If you could bring up that tweet, Dylan. We have Representative Khanna was actually the first Democratic office holder to endorse this idea. And so great news there. What's most fascinating about this idea is that it could essentially allow the United States to become the microstrategy of nations. MicroStrategy's stock performance has been absolutely incredible ever since it became a Bitcoin focused company that has focused on putting Bitcoin as its primary treasury reserve asset. And it's essentially an opportunity for the United States to scoop other countries in the race for Bitcoin adoption. So, really exciting things happening there. Uh, I am very much in support of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Right. I think all of us in the Bitcoin community are, but we're also in support of other prongs of the Trump agenda. One of those is making government a lot more efficient. And I know that was something that you wanted to talk about to close us out today.
Yeah, for the grab bag segment, I think this Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency, is very interesting. Dylan, if you could pull up Elon Musk's tweet about that, I think it's particularly interesting that they want to have a leaderboard for the most insanely dumb spending of your tax dollars, which will be both extremely tragic and extremely entertaining. I think this is fantastic because, I was close with the late Senator Tom Coburn, Dr. Coburn from Oklahoma, who used to put out a waste book every year of how much of your tax dollars are just getting lit on fire with very bad ideas. I mean, there are studies on trans animals, there's studies on, methane emissions from cows. There's a number of government agencies that are duplicative that we could phase out. There are expired programs that are still for some reason getting funded. I think a sort of a zero-based budgeting approach, going back to first principles, looking at what do we actually need the government to do versus what it's currently being funded to do, and really just kind of trimming that fat and leaving a lot on the cutting room floor is going to be fantastic for inflation. It's going to bring down inflation. It's going to make, hopefully, our tax bills go down over time. And it's going to help the government refocus on helping the American people, on protecting the American people, and on doing it in a more cost effective way. So there have been commissions like this in the past. There's the Simpson-Bowles Commission, which was bipartisan, and they made various recommendations, but nothing really came of it. The benefit here is that you have the biggest megaphone in the world, which is the number one news source on the planet in X, run by probably the greatest entrepreneur of our time, who's going to be able to gin up popular support. His America PAC has, I think, millions of signatures of grassroots people, just regular everyday Americans who will be able to call their members of Congress and say, yes, I like what they're doing, or no, I think you should keep that program, or, giving their input. So you're going to have a much more iterative process, much more transparent process with a lot more popular support. And so I think this time is different in a very good, very impactful way. So I can't wait to see the leaderboard. It is going to be both tragic and entertaining, but I think this will actually lead to positive change. And I think we're going to, we're going to have better government, more transparent, more accountable, more cost effective government. And that's going to be just a huge positive for the American people. We saw what happened in Argentina, where Javier Milei was elected president from the Austrian School of Economics, where he started cutting bureaucracy. He dramatically decreased inflation. They were bordering on hyperinflation. And now he's really gotten it back under control. Of course, the swamp punches back. He's had resistance from bureaucrats. I wouldn't expect much different here. We'll have resistance, but like I said, if you have that popular support, you have that transparency, people can judge for themselves. I think our government's going to start to be more accountable to the people and less accountable to the Washington insiders. So I am very hopeful that the Doge actually ends up righting this ship and getting us to a better place fiscally. Of course, for the price of Bitcoin, people look at alternative assets like gold and Bitcoin to hedge against inflation. This may bring inflation down, but I think that'll be offset by the positive policies and really the bear hug, as you said, that Trump has given Bitcoin. I think it's going to be considered a much more mainstream asset. It's going to have a lot more funds flowing in. So notwithstanding the government efficiency group and their work in getting us back on track fiscally, I still think that bull cycle is ahead for Bitcoin, and this whole industry is going to thrive. So really exciting stuff. Can't wait to see the leaderboard. And if I can dig up some really wasteful programs, I want to contribute to the comedy and productivity of this committee.
Yeah. And as you mentioned earlier, Brian, it's in some ways bipartisan. There will be Democrats, I think Elizabeth Warren will be foremost among them, trying to defend things like surveys on transgender monkeys. But for the most part, American people don't want to see their taxpayer dollars incinerated. And so I think, like you said, a lot of this government waste being advertised on the most read news platform on the planet will expose a lot of the government waste that Americans should be rightly incensed about. So this is really exciting to see this happen. I also think that in addition to exposing wasteful government spending, Elon Musk will play a pretty critical role in removing a lot of the unnecessary agencies, federal executive agencies that we have in our country. I think what he did at Twitter, he's intent on doing in the US government itself. And for those who might not remember, at Twitter, now X, he actually laid off about 80% of the staff. And at the time, there was a huge media meltdown. People were saying that Twitter itself could not sustain another week without enough coders, and that it was going to be the death of the company, and that Elon Musk had purchased his company for over $40 billion and he was now driving it to the ground. But lo and behold, all these years later, Twitter, now X, is absolutely killing it. I think you and I both get most of our news through Twitter, and it's arguably better than it's ever been before. I think we're likely to see the same thing as Donald Trump and Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy try to cut government agencies. You're going to see a massive media flip out that's going to be stoked by people in Washington, the swamp, so to speak, as well as corporate advertisers and mainstream media who funnel a lot of their influence through these federal agencies. But in the end, I think it will be right for the country. It'll be better for our bottom lines because Americans ideally won't have to pay as much in taxes. It'll reduce inflation. So bring on the Doge. That's what I say.
Exactly. And there's this, you're already seeing some hand wringing going on right now where people are saying, oh, but the selfless civil servants, the careers who really keep the government running, you can't just get rid of them. No, not true. It's been very unsmall d democratic for a long time because you have a permanent Washington that is not really accountable to the people. Well, to those that are still existing in the bureaucracy, I mean, the choice is supposed to be that either you're on board with the people's president who was elected by the people and you help to execute that agenda, or if you don't want to, then you resign. You don't resist. You don't stay in the government and resist. There's a reason I didn't go to work for the Biden administration because I didn't really agree with what they were doing. Of course, I wouldn't have been appointed to a Biden administration job either, in fairness, but that's the way you should look at it. You're there to either execute the president's agenda or you resign and you go do something else. Another critical policy proposal that Trump has talked about is decentralizing the government. The Bitcoin network is decentralized. That is one of the greatest aspects of it. If you decentralize the government, like in the last administration, the Trump administration moved the Bureau of Land Management out west. That's where most of the government's land is. You have people who are conservationists, people who are keyed into land use issues and how to best make use of it, preserve America's national parks and a lot of our natural resources. You should have American patriots who care deeply about that issue, who are living and breathing those issues every day, working on those things. People who are not, Washington bureaucrats, basically. So if you start doing that for more agencies, a lot of the existing bureaucrats are not going to want to leave. They're not going to want to exist in a brave new world. So they may self-select out, and that's one way to kind of thin the herd. But just generally, decentralizing the government and cutting waste is going to have a huge impact, and it's going to make the government more accountable to the people. That is a good thing, not a bad thing. People voted for the proverbial bull in a china shop. They don't want the status quo, and our country's supposed to, elections are supposed to have consequences. So this whole notion that, and I see the headlines, always appointing loyalists. Of course he's appointing loyalists. You think Barack Obama or Joe Biden appointed people who would oppose his agenda? No, of course not. That would make no sense. So I just see, some of the narratives emerging, I'm already kind of chuckling at, but I think the direction we're headed is a more accountable government to the people, and that will make it a better government overall. So really looking forward to seeing what happens.
Yeah, 100%. To your point, he's actually making government far more democratic than it is now. And I think that's what people don't recognize. Donald Trump is not a threat to democracy. He's a threat to bureaucracy. And that is a good news for every tax-paying American out there, in my opinion. So a lot to look forward to over these next few years. Brian, anything else before we close out today, or is that about round things out?
I think that about rounds things out. Very bullish going forward. Excited to see how things shake out. Watching Appointment Palooza with a great interest. We'll see how the cabinet shapes up and the senior White House staff. He's at a breakneck pace already. We're just a week removed, and he's already made a number of high-profile announcements. So we'll keep an eye on that, and keep an eye on our Bitcoin wallets and stock portfolios, and watching all the market news. And we'll be back next time with hopefully even more positive updates. But so far, things are looking up, up, up. It's going very well.